Welcome to episode 26 of Psychedelic Divas. I'm your host, Carla Detchon, and today's episode was inspired by my sweet husband, who is my biggest fan and very best critic. He told me that I'm always talking about my guides on this podcast and referencing that my guides provided information to me or recommended something or told me to do something. And he said a lot of people have no idea what that means or how to access their own guides. And he's right. I've worked with a lot of psychedelic integration clients who had never had the experience of connecting with or meeting guides in a psychedelic session. I would say that's because many people don't even know it's an option. And if they are aware, they don't know how to make it happen. But working with guides in a psychedelic session is a powerful tool, one that can connect you directly to deeper universal wisdom. So if you find this episode helpful in any way, you can thank my husband for the inspiration. I first learned how to access non-ordinary guides during a 1996 weekend introductory course to shamanism led by Michael Harner, the anthropologist who wrote The Way of the Shaman, the groundbreaking book describing what Harner called core shamanism. In that workshop, Harner used rhythmic drumming to induce a non-ordinary state of awareness, which we could use to journey and access guides and information. Harner led us into the upper, lower, and middle worlds, and we would ask for a guide to appear in those worlds. We then asked these guides questions and received answers. Now, to be clear, this was a totally sober workshop, no psychedelics involved, just the power of the rhythmic drumming to transport you into the non-ordinary state. I learned to journey and access information for myself and for total strangers, which is probably the most powerful part of the weekend, because you could doubt that the information you received for yourself came from an external ally. But when you journeyed for a total stranger and came back with information that resonated for them, it really cemented for me the power of accessing guides for wisdom. It was soon after that I began working with my long-term teacher, Ralph Matzner. I first started working with Ralph as my therapist so that we could get to know each other before he offered to do a one-on-one psychedelic session with me. I was 34 at the time, and I had been using recreational substances for over a decade. In that previous decade of recreational use, it had never crossed my mind to try to connect with a guide or ally and access any type of non-ordinary information. I had definitely experienced information dropping into my awareness during these early psychedelic experiences. But at the time, I would have just said it was my inner knowing or intuition, which, by the way, might be the truth. But my experiences with Michael Harner and Ralph Matzner opened my mind to using both drumming and medicine to formally call upon unseen allies, spirit guides, wisdom voices on the other side, or wherever they may reside. I started regularly accessing this external wisdom in my therapeutic sessions with Ralph. He would guide me into a light meditative state by closing my eyes, paying attention to my breath. After a few moments of relaxing and breathing, Ralph would then direct me to call upon a guide or ally to come into my awareness, and I could then ask questions of that entity during our therapy sessions. In one therapeutic session, Ralph did a past life regression with me, and I had the awareness come to me of two different past lives. In the first one, I had been a male shepherd. I remember going back to work after that lunchtime therapy session and excitedly telling a coworker that I had done a past life regression where I saw that I had been a male shepherd in a previous life. She rolled her eyes and responded, "Well, who wasn't?" Which was probably true, but it totally cracked me up. A few months later, Ralph offered to do a medicine session with me. In that first one-on-one session, he asked me, as part of the session, to ask for help, specifically to call upon an ally. Could have been an ancestor, an angel, an animal, a light being. I mean, there are so many options. He asked me to call for help and to ask for someone or something to come forward and make its presence known so that I could ask it questions in order to provide me with a hopefully wiser perspective than my own. I don't remember who came to me in that first journey, but I do remember that something did answer my call. And the insights that they provided to the questions I answered felt both profound and clear. It felt like I was accessing a wisdom that was outside of my non-ordinary reality, and definitely outside of myself, even though the messages came into my head. It felt like a much stronger, clearer, distinct voice than I had received in the shamanism classes or in the meditative states that Ralph had previously guided me in. The medicine was absolutely amplifying the messages that the guides were sending. I mentioned earlier that prior to working with Michael Harner and Ralph, I had been using psychedelics recreationally for a decade, and I had never really noticed strong voices in my head or a specific connection with a guide. However, after that first Ralph medicine session, when I asked for guidance, every time I used any medicine after that, even recreationally, such as dancing at a club, it felt like I had opened the cosmic door and information flooded in. I realized that these guiding voices had been available all along. But because I had never asked, because I had not invited or called upon them, they had not made their presence known. It felt like once I had opened the door and requested help, they were there, and they haven't shut up since. The communication door has stayed open, and now I can easily access my guides without the use of medicine or even meditation. Although I do make sure I get quiet enough to really listen and get out of my own head. So who am I listening to? To be honest, I can't really say for sure. It's been many decades now of accessing guided information. So I don't always ask specifically who is behind the voice or the information that I'm receiving. And I tend to just refer to them as my guides, as a collective voice. There can be times, however, when I will call upon a specific ancestor, such as my father who has crossed, or a grandparent, or other family elders. I have also specifically requested or had a connection with individual guides such as Ganesh, Kuan Yin, Buddha, Mother Mary, Jesus, specific archangels, various gods and goddesses, and a myriad of other beings, including my dead pets, Mojo and Layla. I've also done a ton of work connecting to both my younger selves to access information and memories that they are holding, and my future self to help chart a course for any potential directions that they might have insight to. Other times, I've just generally connected to Source or universal energies. A few years ago, I took a channeling class where over 100 of us practiced channeled writing every morning, and the shared results were pretty amazing. One person was accessing a group of guides who were pretty hilarious. So for a few weeks, I asked for that group of guides to work with me during the channeled writing exercises. And during that time, the information I was accessing had a completely different tone to it. I was surprised at the difference in the messaging I was receiving and found the whole experiment rather fascinating. I mention all this detail because the one thing I have learned through all this is that anyone can access non ordinary guides who are here to help. It just takes intention, opening to the possibility, inviting them in, clearing your mind of what you think the answer should be, and above all, listening. Hey, fellow explorers. Thoughtful planning and preparation is the foundation of any successful psychedelic journey. And if something does go wrong, knowing how to navigate that difficult space is essential. That's why I wrote my psychedelic safety guide, including what to do when things go wrong. It's filled with tips and tools for keeping you and your friends as safe as possible. You'll find it at our website, psychedelicdivas.com. Please, go get it, read it, and share it. The more we all know, the safer we can keep each other. So, how would you go about starting to work with a guide or guides if that was something that interested you? In Ralph's early medicine groups, he would walk us through a very detailed process in order to connect with a guide. That process started with aligning our bodies with the Earth's axis, and then you would drop your awareness down to the center of the Earth, where you would find the crossroads, where the Earth's axes meet. At that crossroads, you could find the tree of life, an ancient symbol found in many cultures around the world that connects heaven and earth, divinity and humanity. Ralph would then invite us to call in a helper, an otherworldly ally to come forward and make itself known. He would then direct us in how to engage with this ally. First, Ralph always wanted to know from which direction on the crossroads the guide came from, right or left, in front or behind you. If it came from your left, he could associate that with the feminine. If it came from your right, you could associate it with the masculine. In front might be associated with future possibilities, and behind might have something to do with the past. Then he wanted us to notice details about the guide. Was it a person, an animal, a light being? What were they wearing? He wanted us to take note of as many details as we could. Was it a being you were familiar with? Most importantly, Ralph wanted you to greet it properly and ask permission to use them as a guide. This is how Ralph taught us what one dear friend of mine coined cosmic manners. For example, if it was someone you were familiar with but had a difficult relationship with, you were never supposed to reject them by saying something like, "What are you doing here?" That would have been the height of rudeness. Ralph taught us that if it was a human you knew who was showing up to be your guide, it was their soul self, not their personality self that was showing up in medicine space. So never reject them. Simply welcome them and honor that they've taken the time to come be with you and share their perspective. After all, you put out the call for help, and they showed up. So some respect was due. If you didn't know the entity who showed up, you were always supposed to ask their name so you could address them with respect, and so you could call on them by name the next time you requested help. And you were also supposed to ask permission to not just assume that an entity is there to help you. Ask permission to access them as a guide. Ralph also taught us that how we paid these beings for their help was that you paid them with your attention by paying attention to what they had to say. That doesn't mean that you had to do what they said, but that you are respecting their time, their effort to share their wisdom by deeply listening. When we were done engaging with the guides, we concluded the cosmic manners, most importantly, by saying thank you for coming and providing appreciation for their time, their energy, and their wisdom before releasing them. So that was a very formal way that Ralph initially started teaching us how to call on a guide. Over time, however, Ralph made it a lot more informal. We all basically learned that all we needed to do was just ask for help, to request that a guide make themselves present, and then wait and see who shows up. And then all the same rules applied: asking their name, asking their permission to use them as a guide, thanking them for coming, etc. Of course, you can always ask for a specific guide to come. As I mentioned before, there's times when I call on my dad, or I'll call on a specific goddess or archangel or person in my life. And when I do call on a specific human, it's always the soul self, the higher self of that person that I'm inviting to come help me. For example, if you're having relational issues with a person in your life, you can call on their higher self to be in conversation with you to help you figure out how to heal those issues from both their perspective and yours. You can also call on someone you admire, like Oprah, or a favorite wisdom keeper, such as Ram Dass. Maybe you have a favorite clergy member or a beloved teacher whose opinion you might admire and respect. Keeping that person's energy in your consciousness can provide all kinds of interesting input. I think it's why people started wearing those bracelets that said WWJD, what would Jesus do? It's a way of inviting whomever you want to work with to be your guide. It's a way of channeling higher information through your own intuitive knowing by asking that question: what would this person do in this situation? As I've taught this way of working with your guides to my psychedelic integration clients, I've gotten a lot of questions as to the so-called true source of these voices. And to be honest, I don't have a definitive answer on this. I tell my clients it's up to them and their belief system. If you believe in the existence of the spirit world, as I do, then you're more likely to attribute the voices of this guidance to an otherworldly source. If you don't believe in that, then you're more likely to attribute the wisdom to your own intuitive knowing or higher self. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. The only problem I've seen with my clients is that most of us were never taught how to tune in and trust our inner voices, our intuition, our bodily knowing. I have a lot of clients who say, well, I don't trust my inner knowing. I don't trust my intuition. And it makes sense to me because as children, those voices are not honored or recognized. And in fact, they're often rejected or made fun of. So as children, many of us learn to stuff down our intuitive voice. And we actually learn to mistrust our intuition, which is a critical part of our inner feminine energy. We've been told, well, that's not right, or you're making that up, or that's just your imagination. As a result, I've met so many clients, especially women, who have had their inner knowing shut down. Instead, we learn to focus on objective reality, or things that can be externally measured as true, instead of our own internal subjective knowing. We learn to doubt ourselves and to listen to other people's perspectives as having more value than our own. We don't trust our own knowing. That's one of the reasons I studied for a year at an energy school, learning to read energy. And then I worked at the school as a coach and lead trainer for a year. That experience helped to strengthen my inner intuitive knowing. And it worked hand in hand with my psychedelic work and my practice of accessing my guides for knowledge. I found there's a lot of similarity in all of these teachings: the shamanic approach, psychedelics, energy work, channeling. It's all about accessing wisdom and answers from a different level of awareness outside our normal consensus reality. One of the tools that I was taught when I did the energy school training was a very simple process of learning how to put the answer somewhat outside of your conscious mind. And it was called the Rose exercise. And it's a very simple, very basic tool that can help you build up your intuitive muscle. I'll teach it to you now, and you can play with it and see whether it resonates with you or not. Assuming you're not driving, if it's possible to close your eyes, go ahead and close them. And it's also possible to learn to do this with your eyes open, but it's easier to learn it first with your eyes closed. Now just take a second to get centered. A couple of deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. It doesn't have to be a big effort. Just calm your energy and then drop your awareness into your heart center. And from your heart center, I'd like you to imagine projecting out in front of you on a screen a single long stem red rose with a closed bud. Now, take a minute to get clear on that image. A single long stem red rose with a closed bud. Now, I'd like you to imagine that that rose is opening and expanding. And now imagine that all the petals have just been tossed up in the air in exuberance. Now go back to the original rose image where the flower is closed and imagine the head just falling over. It's just wilting. Now imagine it's just flat out on the ground, wilted, totally deflated. So the rose has just shown you some of the ways that it can respond if you ask it for guidance. You can ask it a question and then watch how it moves. Is the rose standing upright? That's a positive. That's a yes, but a fairly neutral yes. Now, the opening rose, that's a stronger yes. And a rose that tosses all its petals excitedly in the air, that's a hell yes. A rose that is starting to tip over, that's not so good. And a rose that is flat on the ground, that's a definite no. And this is how you use the rose as a tool of knowing, as an inner guide. It's a way to build trust in your intuition. In energy school, we were encouraged to use this rose tool as much as we could all day long, starting with simple questions that had low consequences. For example, I would go to the grocery store and use the rose tool to choose fruit or vegetables. Do I want this one or that one? And then just see or feel which way the rose reacted. And I would choose the vegetable that the rose recommended. But I always verified that it was a good choice, which helped me know whether my intuition was right. I used the rose exercise for almost every decision for many years as a way of feeling confident in my own intuitive knowing of a situation. If it interests you, play with it and see how it feels. It's a simple way of getting out of your head and using a different channel to determine your answers. Simply note as you practice it whether your rose answers seem aligned and right for you. Which brings me to an important part of working with external guidance. When it comes to messages that you receive in psychedelic space, it's critical to trust but verify. I always recommend to my clients that they don't make any big life decisions for at least 2 weeks after a journey. Just because your inner guides tell you to quit your job does not mean you should do it right away, or maybe even at all. Universal timing is very different from Earth human time. And so it's important to run all messages received under the influence of psychedelics through your own sober knowing. Maybe even run it by a therapist or a coach or trusted friends so you can really know whether you want to move forward with the wisdom that you accessed. Those of you following this podcast know that I received the message to do the podcast in a psychedelic journey. And in that state, it sounded like a great idea while I was high. But once I sobered up, I had serious doubts about coming above ground with my psychedelic use. And it took me 2 years to actually manifest that message. Remember, you're the one who is still in charge. You're simply asking these allies for their perspective, their wisdom, their input. And then you get to sit with it because it's ultimately your final decision. Because you're the one who has to live with the consequences of any actions. But I also advise being careful in medicine space to what you agree to do. Once you've made those agreements, the universe tends to hold your feet to the fire. And I had said in medicine space that I would do this podcast. So while I resisted, I knew I had to do it, or there would be consequences. So I started this episode by honoring my husband, who told me I should explain to people about how to work with their guides. So I'll end this episode with a funny story about our first date. We were having dinner, and he was asking me about my relationship history. And he asked me why I ended my last relationship. And I just flippantly said, oh, because the voices told me to. So while it was true that my guides had expressed that it was time for that relationship to end, I didn't provide any backstory to my husband at the time other than that one sentence. And what I didn't realize at the time was how my future husband had taken my offhand remark. See, he's a licensed clinical psychologist. And when I mentioned that I was listening to the voices in my head, he thought I might be certifiably crazy. We obviously worked it out, but it's still a good reminder to go slow with your beloveds when it comes to sharing any messages you might receive. You might want to provide a little more context rather than just saying, the voices in your head told you to do it. That's it for today. As always, I so appreciate you listening and following along on this journey together. You know the drill. If you found this episode valuable, please consider sharing it, giving it 5 stars or a thumbs up, or maybe even a nice review. And thank you to those of you who have done that already. And if you haven't snagged a copy of my psychedelic safety tips, including what to do when things go wrong, well, why not? Well, let's take care of that right now. You can get it this second by going to psychedelicdivas.com. Thanks for listening and for being on this growth journey together. See you next time.